Good day, and welcome to the Rise from Eden podcast with Steve and Dr. Mike, the channel that focuses on Jungian philosophy and psychology. For today's first episode, we talk about with Dr. Mike, our co-host, who is a doctorate of philosophy, and with myself, a philosophy graduate, the topic of synchronicity. So before we begin, why don't you tell us about synchronicity, Dr. Mike?
All right. Well, synchronicity isn't very easy to understand. It's a concept that was used by Carl Jung, and it refers to a special kind of a coincidence. It's a coincidence which is sort of like a coming together of inner and outer events in a way that cannot be readily explained by cause and effect. But it's a kind of coincidence that is really, really meaningful to the observer. So let's explore that a little bit. A lot of us have had coincidences that we've experienced in the past. And some of these coincidences are, well, just basically just coincidences, right? You were thinking of a person and then you come across that person on the street. It's a friend of yours that you have met in a long time. And you would say, well, that's a really strange coincidence. But there are coincidences which are very, very, very unusual. Let us say you had a dream about someone, a friend of yours that you hadn't met in a very, very, very long time. And then the next day you're walking and you go to a random shop, and you find that friend there. Again, it is a coincidence, and we can say, hey, this is just a coincidence. And we can attribute this to just plain old coincidence. And I don't really know whether you could call this meaningful. So I wonder whether this kind of a coincidence really classifies as a synchronicity. But let us say that you've just been fired from your job. All right, you've been fired from your job, and now you're looking for work. And then you dream of that friend, a friend of yours whom you haven't met in a very long time. And then you're walking along in a shopping mall or somewhere, and you meet this friend of yours by chance. And it just so happens that this person is looking for someone to fill a particular position in his company. And when you tell him that you're looking for a job, it's a perfect fit for you. In that particular case, this particular coincidence doesn't seem like it's just a coincidence. It hits you very strongly, and you begin to wonder why that actually happened. It seems like coincidences like this have a deeper underlying structure, and you would say, hey, this seems like more than just a coincidence. It seems like something important is going on here that I cannot understand. I think that's what synchronicity refers to. Yes.
Interesting. So would you say that you've had some recent experiences that, let's say, evoke this nature or this pattern of synchronicity? Like, how are you, man? Like, how are you doing? And how do you think your recent experiences are relating to this concept that we're talking about today?
Well, not recently, not really recently, but I remember a time in the past where I was reading a lot about synchronicity, and it seems like the more you read about synchronicity, and the more you write down synchronistic events or unusual coincidences in a journal that you have, the number of synchronicities that you experience begins to proliferate. And there was a time before when I kept a journal of coincidences or synchronicities. And there was one day where I had about 22 or 23 unusual coincidences all in one day. But usually what happens is whenever I am in a situation where I need some kind of an answer, let's say I'm in a crisis, or there's something that I need. I wanted to come up with a really good topic for my dissertation. I had been writing my dissertation for quite some time, and I was writing along a particular line of thought, and I found out that this was not workable. So I had a dream, and the dream led me to a particular person who led me to a particular book, and that book actually gave me the answer to the topic. Let me it showed me what topic I needed to focus on. So things like that actually happen quite frequently. There was a time, for example, in the
So it's like things.
there was a time in the past when I wanted to quit my job, and I was already ready to quit my job. And I was walking, and I came across someone quite by accident. And I told him what I was going to do, that I was going to quit my job, and the next day I would be somewhere else. And he looked at me very quizzically, and he said, "Are you serious? Do you know what you're going to do if you know what? Do you know what's going to happen if you actually do this?" And I thought about that, and I went home, and I decided to stay. All right, which happened to actually be the right decision for me. Yes. So things like that usually happen.
So it's like things that you'd think are merely coincidental, but they seem to have some
That's
meaning
right.
to it.
Exactly.
So for our listeners, it's basically the theory that the things are more bound to a certain kind of pattern. Like there's an inner harmony that flows through things, where things are not just merely cause and effect, that it's not just the laws of physics in play. There seems to be a certain kind of meaning behind things that happen, that sometimes they feel so coincidental that it can't just be a coincidence merely, but they feel meaningful. So another way to term synchronicity, would you agree, Dr. Mike, is like a form of serendipity?
It's something like that. But if some coincidence happens and it really strikes you, and if you've been thinking about a particular question, like you've been wondering whether to stay in a relationship, for example, or you've been wondering whether to quit your job, or you're working on a particular project, let's say you're writing a particular point and you're stuck, and there's a particular image that you're looking for and you can't find it, and suddenly you come across something that really fits everything, that could be meaningful as well. So what I like to do is, when I experience meaningful coincidences like that, I always ask the question, what could this possibly mean? So in short, it's like a Rorschach. It's just a coincidence for everybody else, but I ask the question, what could this possibly mean? And if I continue to ask that question, I might actually get a response from deep down inside me, you could say from deep inside my psyche, which would actually be a very good response to a question that I've been working with. So that's what I normally do. So my suggestion is, whenever you have experiences like that, it would be a good idea to ask the question, what might this actually mean? And if you focus on that and you ask the question, what might this actually mean, you might get a particular response. Yes.
That's a very good idea, actually. So for our listeners out there, they can take note of that. But I'm trying to play devil's advocate here and thinking about people who are doubting this, let's say, this theory. Would they say perhaps that it's simply just a projection of what you feel like? For example, it's just us ascribing certain things or certain meanings to things that don't really mean anything in the first place. What would you say to those people?
Well, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter whether it's actually just a projection, because even if it were just a projection, but it becomes very useful, and you use that coincidence to actually help you understand particular things that are going on in your life, well, what's wrong with that? It's like if you're having a dream, you can take the dream in all sorts of ways. You can imagine that the dream doesn't actually have any meaning. But if you were to try to ask yourself, what does this dream mean? And if that leads you somewhere, and it leads you to a particular understanding of a particular situation that you are in right now, and it provides you with very important clues. Let us say, for example, that you're about to get married and you're wondering whether it's really the right decision for you. And certain coincidences happen, or you have particular dreams, and these dreams make you question that decision. It might be time, for example, to actually rethink that decision, to ask yourself whether it was really the right thing for you to do. And there's actually nothing wrong with that. Yes.
Yeah. So in a certain sense, we could even have synchronistic dreams, right? Where synchronicity appears in dreams because it matches up with certain problems
Yes,
we are
correct.
trying to deal with. So you're saying, Dr. Mike, that in the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what is the, for example, metaphysical assumption, or even the what kind of system this works in, or how it even occurs, regardless if we only project these meanings to them or not. What's the point is that it's quite useful for us, and that it helps us figure out things or
Correct.
solve our
Exactly.
problems.
Exactly. And one thing you
But actually,
recognize
yeah.
once you start paying attention to synchronicities is that there are many types of coincidences that happen out there. There are some coincidences which are just coincidences and they're not really meaningful. But there are those which are very, very, very mysterious. And it makes you wonder whether things are really interconnected. We have this idea that things are very separate, but there's been a long tradition in Eastern philosophy that things are more interconnected than we actually realize. So imagine this particular kind of coincidence. You're planning to buy a dog, all right? You're planning to buy a dog, and you're doing a little bit of research. So you do a little bit of research, and you find out that the best dog for you is of a particular breed. So when you go out, you start to notice this particular breed of dog as you are walking. That's not really a coincidence. It's just that those dogs were already there, but you never paid attention to them before because you were not interested in buying a dog. So that is very easy to explain. You might think, oh, why is it that I'm seeing all these breeds of dogs around me? They were not there before. This might be a synchronicity. It might not be that at all. It might just be a coincidence. All right? I would regard that as a coincidence. And if you're trying to buy a car and you settle on a particular brand of car, a particular model of Nissan or something, and then you're going around, you're driving around, or you're commuting, and you keep seeing that particular car, well, you probably saw that car model before, but you never paid attention to it. So that's easy to explain. However, if you're looking for a dog, all right, and you settle for a particular breed of dog, and then one day your friend, let's say 2 days later, you get a phone call from your friend, a friend of yours, and he says he's been gifted with like 3 or 4 puppies, and he asks you if you want to have one, and it's exactly that breed of dog that you were looking for. Then you wonder whether it's just a simple coincidence. You get the picture here. There are many types of coincidences, but some types of coincidences make you wonder whether there is something else out there that is at work. It's not like, your desire to have a particular breed of dog actually made things happen. I don't think it's like that at all. But it does seem like if you encounter situations like this, it does seem like things are more interconnected than we care to think. Yeah.
Yes. It seems to me that in our current 21st century arena, you would say that the Western world, for example, has pioneered the thought that things are more mechanical than they seem, where there's laws of physics, where, for example, one action leads to another. But according to Eastern philosophy, we would think that actually perhaps the world is more interconnected than it seems, where there's like a web of things that everything is actually connected. Like, for example, the web, I believe, in Buddhist or Hindu philosophy, where they call it the web or the Indra's net, I think, where they said that everything or every one of us is actually within this web, like a spider's web, where each web is actually connected to each in a certain way. And it kind of ties into perhaps even science in itself, where some people might use science to counter things that seem meaningful within coincidences. because they might say, oh, coincidences are merely coincidences. It's just us ascribing certain meanings to it, like perhaps a kind of cognitive dissonance even. But even science has chaos theory, which kind of like shows the relation of how things could lead to another without expecting it to. For example, the butterfly effect, which kind of ties into the notion of Indra's net, or even how perhaps Carl Jung's idea, the founder of synchronicity, who said that perhaps we're just droplets of water in a vast ocean, and in the end we're all connected.
Correct. So whenever you have experiences like that, what happens is that your sense of mystery gets a lot stronger and a lot deeper, and it makes you wonder whether your rational understanding of the world is actually correct. So what happens whenever you experience a number of meaningful coincidences like that happen again and again and again? It starts to make the world a little more mysterious, you know? And that's what I like about trying to focus or pay attention to synchronicities like that, because it makes the world a little more mysterious. Yes, correct.
And it does seem that once we pay more attention to this, regardless whether we, for example, quote unquote, believe in the metaphysical assumption that, okay, perhaps there really is a web underlying all this, perhaps there really is an interconnection between all things. And even if we don't, let's say we just skip the presupposition and just believe that, okay, perhaps there is a connection, and just dive straight into it and just start to notice little things, start to pay attention to the things, as you said. That once you take note of these little things, that okay, maybe there are certain things that I haven't really paid attention to that seem to make sense, that seem to connect, that seem to have a trend, a pattern in my life and my life around me.
Exactly. And usually coincidences like this happen when, for example, you have made an existential choice, or you encounter a fork in the road, and you wonder whether you're on the right path. I remember once somebody came up to me and said, I wonder whether I should be a writer. And then at some point she decided, yeah, I think that's what I want to do with the rest of my life. I really want to write, and I want to be a writer. And as soon as she made that particular decision, she it was almost magical. She started meeting writers along the way. All right, and it was very, very strange, because it seemed like a confirmation to her that this was the path that she really needed to take. So it's amazing. For example, when I made a decision to specialize in a particular genre of music, because I was playing guitar, I found a particular teacher for that genre right away. It was very immediate. He didn't want to teach it to anyone, but he decided to teach it to me. And then it just so happened that somebody else was taking up that later on was taking up that particular genre under this particular teacher. And it so happened that he knew a dancer, and we got together and we formed a band. And it was very strange, because as soon as I made that decision and I was looking for an instrument, there were so many instruments around, and so many people were offering me an instrument to buy. And it was so easy to actually buy that instrument. And now when I look around, it's not available anymore. So what this says is that if you have made a very important decision and you're wondering whether it's a decision that is actually right or not, every once in a while you encounter situations that prove to you either that it was the right decision to make, because so many things begin to happen without you're actually planning to do so. And if it's really not the right thing for you to do, then you get intimations of that as well from particular people that you meet, or particular events that happen, which are very strange coincidences indeed. Yeah.
So interesting. You mentioned how people, or even yourself, make a certain decision or make certain intentions, and those intentions or decisions actually are the catalysts to trigger certain synchronicities where things simply fall into place and everything just goes,
Exactly.
like it just goes on a roll, right? So it makes me wonder about the connection between the mind, like our psyche, and how it somehow, the notion of an intention from our psyche or from our mind, like this decision, this intention, or like a decision in our minds, like a will to do something, actually affects the material world that we live in. So it's somehow like a mind over matter, like the mind affecting the physical plane that we live in. Like, this is interesting because I know that Carl Jung has talked about this with certain physicists as well, right? Like Wolfgang Pauli, etc. How there's a link between psyche and matter, psyche and the physical world. So what would you say about that,
when you
Dr.
hear about something like that, it sounds very new age, right? It sounds like really implausible. Like
Yes, exactly.
something that you would hear from someone who's into conspiracy theories and all that. But the best thing to do is to try it out yourself and try to experiment. So what would happen if one day you keep a journal? So you keep a journal strictly for strange coincidences like that. And you tell yourself, all right, I have this particular concern in mind. It could be a creative project that you're working on, or it could be a decision that you want to make, or you're wondering whether you should leave your job or whatever it is. Or you're looking for ideas for a particular business project, all right? Keep that in mind and say to yourself, I wonder what would happen if I take a look at coincidences and see whether things begin to happen, mysterious things begin to happen, and you begin to experience strange coincidences. And if you do, and if you write these things down into your notebook and ask yourself, what could these things possibly mean, all right? Write that down, write all the details down, describe in detail what happened. And if you notice that more and more synchronicities begin to occur, and you connect that with particular concerns that you have at present, check it out and see what happens. I tried that particular experiment. So I began with a blank slate. I began with the belief that these so-called synchronicities are really not synchronicities. They're just coincidences. I began with that. And I go, let's put this to the test. What if we assume that there's a greater connection between mind and matter? What if we begin by with the assumption that things are not as simple as we think, that there is some kind of underlying order? And we put that to the test by doing that, keeping a journal, taking note of synchronicities, asking questions, and seeing whether we get insights regarding these questions by means of the synchronicities that we experience. And if you try it out, I wonder what would happen. So really the best thing to do is to think about this as something that you could experiment with. So begin with an open slate, begin with an open mind, forget the idea that it's new age or whatever, and try it out and see what happens. So what I suggest to anyone who's listening to this is simply to try to conduct an experiment to see whether this would actually work. Yes, right.
Like a test, right? And then like see for yourselves whether or not it's gonna work, whether or not there's actually things that you notice, and see how it goes. Very interesting. In a sense, it's because Carl Jung actually theorized these things, and that's why a lot of people brand him not as a scientist or even as a proper psychologist, but some kind of hippie religious guy, because his theories do sound new agey, but all these things can be explained by his underlying thoughts in his multiple books. For example, how mind over matter, as we talked about, leads to the notion of his idea that our psyches, our minds, are actually kind of like a sea, where we are simply fishes, where we don't understand, or we don't actually realize that the entire world that we live in is actually a sea. We're entrenched in a sea, and we don't realize we're breathing underwater.
So it's really amazing. Some years ago, I had this friend, and we would meet. I was in a group that would meet once every week, all right? And we would meet every week because we had met in a workshop somewhere. And she told us about a dream that she had. It was a recurring dream. And in that dream, she saw someone, someone that she never met. And she described that person to us in detail. A foreigner, all right? A foreigner, someone with blonde hair and so forth, all right? And she described that person in detail. And a few weeks later, we met her again, and she said, she was working in a hotel. And there was actually a client in the hotel that looked exactly like that person. Eventually, they got to meet, and eventually they got engaged and got married. That, for me, shows how interesting the world really is, and that there are patterns underneath that we really don't recognize.
Yes, and it's far more interesting to think about that as something special rather than just a mere coincidence, don't you think? So it kind of goes with the notion of how symbolic the world really is, and that there's like hidden threads underneath certain things. How, for example, I think that it's the Japanese who say that people who are bound to each other actually have like an invisible red thread that is linked between them. So it's like goes with this notion of a hidden thread that ties people together. And how it all ties together, as Carl Jung would say, is that because we're all in a sea and we're all underwater, and the water is kind of like the medium upon which our intentions, our thoughts, our destinies, or even fate, one could say, it's all linked with one another. And it kind of appears in the things that we notice, like synchronicities, or little things that pop up, or even in our dreams, because the dreams, as Carl Jung would say, is like a manifestation or something like what our psyche is trying to tell our conscious selves. It kind of makes me think about the notion of tarot reading too, because I think amazing? It works under the
tarot when you mentioned it. All right, that's really strange. Okay, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, so that in itself, one might even say is like a minor synchronicity or a coincidence. It's up to you, my dear readers, what you would think.
I was wondering whether
listeners, yeah.
And this particular synchronicity that we had just now is giving me the impression that maybe I should go back and go back to tarot symbols, because there was a time when I used to read the tarot, and I found that to be very useful for myself. Yes.
Yes, it's very interesting because as you know, I've been reading the tarot for a while now, and I've just had a reading yesterday. And the notion of the tarot is that it uses some kind of, one could say it's also a projection, what you talked about a while ago, that perhaps the meanings we ascribe to a tarot reading is just kind of like our projections, or what we ascribe to the cards, rather than the card is telling something to us. But regardless of the presupposition of what one believes, it kind of ties in with synchronicity, how the cards are random. It's a deck of cards which you shuffle, so it's seemingly random. But then when you lay it out, it tells meanings that seem meaningful to you. So it's kind of like going back again to the notion of how the mind, or our intentions, or even our deepest desires, or our fate or destinies, let's say perhaps in a greater sense of destiny, or even our paths at the current moment, are kind of like affecting the physical plane, like the cards, which are physical objects, sort of like paper. But then the arrangement of the cards are being influenced by our current situation and the way we shuffle it. And for example, New Age people, or even people from the occult, would call it energies that influence the material plane from our minds, and even vice versa. Material things can influence the mind in a certain sense. What would you think? What would you say?
Yeah, that's absolutely
about energies, even.
It's very hard to put your finger on it, but it's something that we all experience at one time or another. Yeah, that's correct. Exactly.
In a certain sense, I'm not really talking about synchronicity now, right? it's more like the underlying mechanism that allows synchronicity to
correct.
happen. So this is like a more theoretical stance where how come synchronicity occurs? Is it because everything is connected? If everything is connected, Carl Jung would say that it's because our psyches are actually kind of combined with the material world, where there are certain energies that crisscross back and forth, so to speak. That perhaps certain things are willed by what Carl Jung calls the soul, or even the Jungian Self, where the self has a destiny where what is currently meant for you at the moment, or even in the future as a whole. You mentioned, Dr. Mike, that there was someone you knew who decided to be a writer, and perhaps their Jungian self felt that it was their soul's purpose to become a writer at that moment in time. And so it was their soul using the powers of the psyche, or so to speak, Carl Jung would say, affecting the arena that she lived in, the experiences that she's having, to allow things to go smoothly, or even your experience of deciding to play the guitar in a certain genre of guitar, and how suddenly things fell into place, how things suddenly just combined together into like mind and matter just in perfect harmony.
Exactly. It's really
so it's very, very
because,
interesting.
Carl Jung talks about his deeper self, right, in the capital S. And it might happen that your deeper self has interests or desires that might come in conflict with your ego. And when your ego begins to understand that your inner self might have desires that your ego doesn't want, and if you simply allow that to happen, it seems like the world out there will give you a confirmation that you're on the right track. Or sometimes you might be struggling with something because your ego does not want to accept where yourself wants you to go. And you get these coincidences as a kind of a warning, perhaps a kind of a warning signal, or it could be some kind of indication that there is a need for you perhaps to change, and to look at some of the patterns that you have that are getting in the way of understanding the deeper self. Yes, exactly.
Really interesting. So, Dr. Mike, what would you say are perhaps some barriers of the ego? Some would say that the ego is the conscious mind, the rational mind, that perhaps would discount things of this quote-unquote new age nature, that there's an interconnection between things, a hidden connection, that the self, with a capital S, or the soul, would want, let's say, the individual to do, because Carl Jung would say that each person has like a certain destiny, that each man has their own path, a hidden path that one must figure out for themselves. But then the ego sometimes might reject this path, and these coincidences are like warning signs, or even signposts of where they should go. What would you say is what makes each person's paths different? What dictates this certain destiny? And if so, then is there a free will to this?
I'm not really sure
to this notion.
That. It seems like, you can't help but choose to believe in free will. I don't know. I really don't know how you could live if you choose to believe that human beings are not free. So I wouldn't even go there.
Exactly.
Right. And I think you were talking about resistance earlier, and I think one of the greatest resistance that human beings have is the resistance to understand the symbolic language of the inner self. So people don't pay attention to their dreams. People don't pay attention to their intuitions. And I think that people are always asking that how can I be happy, and how can I live well, and so forth. But really, one way by which you could actually get the life that you really want is by listening to particular clues that come from inside of you. Because these clues, and they come usually in symbols, if you recognize what these symbols mean and you pay attention to them, then you're going to get an idea of where you need to go, or what you need to do, and so forth. So that's the basic resistance. The resistance, I think, is coming from this idea that, one, we are really separate selves, And second, that the, the egoic mind really knows how to solve all the problems that are out there. Exactly.
So would you say that people who believe in the egoic mind have a lot of resistance to, let's say, trying out this notion of synchronicity, or just trying out to pay attention
Yes,
to things
exactly.
and seeing if there are synchronistic events going on? And it seems to me that synchronicity is just one of the things that is like a tool, for example, that allows us to listen to the guidance of that's coming from inside us, like the psyche or the soul or the self with a capital S, that Carl Jung would say. It's just one of the things that help us understand what to do. It's just one of those things that help us guide ourselves towards what we need to do. And one of them is synchronicity, like synchronistic events. But then there's a lot more, like the symbols of and patterns of things. Like dreams are full of symbolic language, and it's this kind of language of synchronicities and dreams, and archetypal patterns that Carl Jung would say, that allows us to peer into things that perhaps there's a greater meaning behind these things, that we're not just individuals isolated from one another, but there's like a grand, let's say, not even a culture, but a grand underpinning beneath humanity, or even not just beneath humanity, but over or encapsulating humanity, that
Exactly.
is more collective than it seems.
You spoke about the different ways of actually accessing the deeper layers of the psyche. One is through synchronicity, another is through dream work, another would be tarot reading and looking at the symbols of the tarot and paying attention to symbols wherever we find them. Actually, they're all interrelated. You'll notice that if you pay more attention to your dreams and try to ask what these dreams might actually mean, you might actually have more synchronistic experiences as well. So the two seem to be very deeply connected. If you take the tarot and you start looking at the symbols and the images in the tarot, that might give you more vivid dreams that you will remember. And your dreams might be a little more archetypal as well, because you've been engaging with the symbols in the tarot. And when that happens, you're going to experience even more synchronicities. So I think all of those elements are very deeply connected as well. So if you start with dreams, something is going to happen. You're going to have more synchronistic experiences. And if you start with tarot symbolisms, your experience of synchronicities would also increase as a result. So I think they're all interconnected. Yes.
Yes. So it's like if we start with synchronicities, you tend to have more dreams and more vivid dreams. For example, if you're the type of person who doesn't really dream, the more you know the synchronicities, the more you'll actually have dreams, or even more vivid dreams. And vice versa. Sometimes when you tend to pay attention,
when you're reading a book or you're looking around you, suddenly an image pops up, or something that you see on screen while you're watching TV, something just pops up, and it seems like a symbol that's connected with a synchronistic event that you just experienced, or it's connected to a dream that you had. So what happens when you engage in all these things is that something happens to the way you attend to the world. The world becomes a little more magical, so that certain things begin to stand out and become symbolic for you. So while you're having a conversation with someone, for example, and that person simply mentions a word or an object that they saw, it might become very meaningful because it connects with a dream that you had. Yeah, suddenly you begin to notice how all these things interconnect. Precisely.
Yes, so it's like a vice versa effect, but not just vice versa, because there's more than just two. There's dreams, there's synchronicities, there's even the notion of intuition and just like feeling your gut and using that kind of non-verbal cue, non-verbal kind of language that's similar across dreams and synchronicities, where it's not really like a text-based type of communication. It's like a symbolic kind of communication where you use your intuitions, that they all connect to one another, where you're more alert to your gut feelings, your intuitions, you suddenly have more dreams, you start to have some tarot card readings, and they all like influence one another, and it's all interconnected. Precisely, yeah. It's very, very interesting. And all of these are like underpinned by the notion of how they're all connected, how they're interconnected by a certain thing. And I think maybe that's why it's a good idea we started with this episode about synchronicity, because I think it's synchronicity is the concept that underlies all these things together, the symbolic language, the thing that connects all these
really
things together.
With that.
Would you agree?
What I really would like to advise to anyone who's listening to this is see what happens when you start reading about synchronicities. You can Google that. You can start reading books by Carl Jung or any kind of secondary material that you could get hold of. You could get a hold of talking about synchronicity, and then keep a synchronicity journal. Try to pay more attention to your dreams and put this to the test. Experiment and see what happens. So I think that's the best thing to do. We could talk about synchronicity the whole day, and you might come up with one theory or another theory about why this happens. But the most important thing is to try to experiment with it to see what happens as a result. Because if you do this and you start getting very deep insights, you'll discover that we're not just talking about this as a hypothetical concept, that this is actually real. So really, it's something that you need to test, and you're not going to be convinced until you put it to the test. Yes.
So like it's fun to talk about it. It's fun to just theorize what's the underlying mechanism about it in a hypothetical sense. But to really grasp it and to really appreciate this, it seems to me that it's really best to just test it out, to experiment it yourself, to experience it yourself, and that's really the best way you can truly understand and comprehend what this is all about. Yeah, we can talk about how synchronicity ties in with the symbolic language, how it goes into the topic of archetypal images, like the archetypes by Carl Jung, which we can discuss in a future episode, or even how it ties in with dream work and dream analysis, which we can also talk about in a future episode, like dream interpretation. But I guess one takeaway from this first episode in this podcast is that synchronicity is like something is just one part of it, and that it's really something that you just should just try it out for yourself, experiment and see where it leads you, and then it kind of like gets you into this realm, this world of symbolic languages, this realm of archetypal images that a lot of people don't really experience now in this modern day.
Rather than dream work or let's say mandalas and things of that nature. The nice thing about starting with synchronicities is that once you start to experience them, then you begin to understand that the world is not what we think it is. That there's a lot of things going on out there and inside of you that you may not have paid attention to before. And once that particular thought arises in you, then you begin to see the world a little more shamanically, if you could say that. And you start seeing the interconnection of things, and that's going to make your experience of yourself and the world and other people much, much deeper. Yes.
Yes. It's a good starting topic to really drill in the thought that everything's interconnected, that it's not as bland or as plain as things seem to be. Like there's a quote from The Little Prince would say is that there are things invisible from the naked eye, that things are not what they seem. There's like something hidden beyond it, and synchronicity is like a really good starting point to start to see those things, those hidden patterns. But then it also makes me think about how the Sufis, this branch of religion from the Muslims, right? The Sufi mystics would say that there are hidden patterns in reality, but they would also say that it's not even that hard to see them. We just have to let the scales from our eyes fall and remove our, let's say, conditionings, and we can see the true nature of things, the true interconnections of things far more easily than you would actually think they would be.
Step to take the plunge and to say, I'm going to keep my mind a little more open to see what would happen as a result. Yes.
Yes, and that's synchronicity,
Exactly.
I suppose, and I think that's a good start. And
No,
is there anything else you'd like
we've-
to add, Dr. Mike,
we've pretty much
regarding
covered it.
synchronicity?
I don't
Any
think we
tips,
can really
advice,
talk
parting
about all
thoughts?
the theoretical underpinnings of synchronicity. There are so many books out there that you can find which would talk about that. Really, what I want to emphasize here is that this is something that you need to put to a test. And if you try it out and it doesn't work, then drop it. Drop it. It's not for you. But if you try to work with synchronicities and see whether they actually happen, and you keep a journal of strange coincidences that happen to you, and if you notice that the more you pay attention to coincidences, that the more that they happen, and the more that you read about synchronicities, the more you actually experience them. If that happens to you, then that would be a confirmation that there's something going on out there, which is a lot more mysterious than we think.
Yes. Excellently worded, Dr. Mike. Well, I suppose that's the end of our episode, and I hope you listeners out there had a great time and learned a few things. So thank you for listening to the first episode of the Rise from Eden podcast, Synchronicity. Stay tuned for our next episode and stay safe. Bye. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Bye, Dr. Mike. Thanks for hosting with me. Thank you.